Hi, everyone. This is our third interview in the Web3 accessibility series. This talk is focused on Web3 browser accessibility and browser accessibility in general, although we will also discuss accessibility work and insights specific to WebAIM. So we are privileged to have with us today Jared Smith, Director of WebAIM. Jared is a globally renowned expert who has provided web accessibility training to tens of thousands of web professionals throughout the world. He has over 20 years of experience working in the web design, development, and accessibility field. He brings a wealth of knowledge and experience and is used to helping others create and maintain highly accessible web content. So thank you for being here today, Jared.
That's good to be here. Thank you.
So I want to start off with, can we cover a brief overview of WebAIM Million 2023 and just maybe go over a snapshot of high-level findings?
Sure.
This is useful for individuals who are not aware in the blockchain space.
Yeah, you bet. So the WebAIM Million is an annual analysis of the accessibility of the home pages for the top 1 million websites. So we use some automated testing using Wave, which is an accessibility testing tool that we have developed to test 1 million homepages, the most popularly, commonly used homepages to collect accessibility data. This provides a really good insight into the types of things that are happening out there on the web when it comes to accessibility and trends over time. We've now done this for 5 years. And it's really interesting to just see progress or the lack thereof of accessibility of these pages over time. So again, 1 million homepages. Our 2023 analysis that was done earlier this year found 50 errors on average per page. So those are just detectable errors, which is important to note because automated tools can't test all aspects of accessibility. But the fact that on the average homepage, a user with disability may encounter 50 potential barriers, I think is pretty significant. And that number has decreased a little tiny bit over the last few years. The numbers come down a little bit, but not too much. Still quite a few number of detectable errors on the average homepage. We've also found that homepages are getting significantly larger or more complex. The number of page elements on the average homepage right now on the web is over 1,000 elements. Now that's like code elements in the back end, but it does represent an increase in code complexity and likely page and content and functionality complexity on the page. And so that's like a 10% increase per year that we're seeing with homepage complexity. And so if we think about accessibility and usability of the web, if pages are every year are getting 10% larger and more complex, it's a bit of a challenge, I think, for good usability and good accessibility to keep pace with that, right? I kind of think in some ways that if we could rein in the complexity of the web and instead of just expanding, this really alarming rate, if we could control that a little bit, I think that the rate of accessibility improvement and usability improvement would also proportionally increase over time. So that's one interesting finding from our WebAIM Million analysis. Another thing that we test for is for conformance with the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, formalized set of published standards for accessibility. We found that 96.3% of homepages have detectable WCAG, Web Content Accessibility Guideline failures. So almost all of the homepages out there have some aspect of non-conformance when it comes to accessibility guidelines, which is also a bit alarming. And that number has improved just very, very marginally, really a tiny bit over the last 5 years that we've conducted this research. So one thing that is, I think, maybe a bit positive, at least could be a positive, is that the vast majority of the accessibility errors or issues that we detect in homepages fall into just a few categories. The most common detectable issue is low contrast text, so not enough brightness between the foreground and background colors to improve readability, missing alternative text for images, empty links and buttons, so functional elements, usually that are just images that don't convey any text to indicate what they would be used for, primarily for, say, a blind screen reader user. Inputs that do not have associated labels that would describe the functionality of those inputs, and then missing document language. So the language of the document is not defined, which is really important for accessibility, especially screen reader accessibility. So, just those 5 categories, if we could just really address those 5 categories of issues, then, the accessibility of the web would significantly improve. We'd be going from, 50 errors per page, maybe down to a handful of errors per page, if we could just address those 5 things. And those 5 things are all pretty straightforward. Accessibility issues are easy to test. We can test them readily and via automated processes. And generally, they're pretty easy to remediate and to fix. And so, if there's a bright spot of our research, it's that maybe just focusing on those few things should really have a significant impact on the accessibility for people with disabilities of the web generally.
Fair. And we've definitely taken the survey and all the findings from WebAIM into account in our own personal research so we're exploring the decentralized app layout in Web3. So it's kind of similar findings. Color contrast is the most frequent for us as well. And then a lot of things carry over.
Yeah, great.
And so then I want to transition to the second question. And we actually asked this in our second interview, and the answer was color contrast. But it's a good question to ask, and thank you for being here with your level of experience. So accessible design is a dynamic process that constantly needs testing and retesting. Sometimes changes that work for one group may not work for everyone. Have you encountered any examples of a code or a design change that was intended to help one group, but needed maybe further refinement to fix for others?
Yeah, I think those are relatively rare, at least if we're talking about end users with various types of disabilities. I don't think it's very common to have maybe something that addresses the need of one user that would impact a user with a different type of disability. And typically those types of conflicts can typically be resolved just through some good usability. I was talking about usability first, and then the accessibility is so much easier. You mentioned contrast. Contrast isn't just an accessibility thing; it's a usability thing. We all struggle to read text that has insufficient contrast, especially as our eyes get older. We lose contrast acuity, and so while there might be some tension in the need for higher amounts of contrast, I'm not talking like really high contrast, just not horrible contrast between like design preferences from somebody that maybe prefers that gray text on a gray background for design reasons because everybody else is doing it. And kind of a tension between that design group and the users. Good sufficient contrast for text is really going to be beneficial for everybody. So that's an area where I don't see a tension across disability types, but maybe sometimes we do see some tension between those that are designing things, just design it with lower contrast, very often without fully understanding the accessibility and usability implications of that. Where we do see some real conflict, I think, between accessibility techniques are generally in the category of cognitive and learning disabilities, which is by far the largest disability group that's out there, but also can be a little tricky to fully meet all of their needs because you may have one user, for instance, that benefits from graphical content, illustrations and icons and things like that, and another user that is greatly distracted by those graphical elements and would prefer just a more plain text type of content. And so those are some kind of tensions that can be a little bit difficult to resolve. Usually those types of things can be addressed just by making your content adaptable, right? Adaptable to that user's needs. Maybe using good graphics and illustrations and things like that, but ensuring that they have alternative text that can be presented in place of those images for somebody that doesn't want to see those images and would prefer to read the text alternatives instead. And so usually if we think about that and get creative with those, with the adaptability of our content, we can usually avoid any of those potential conflicts or things between those different user groups.
Totally fair. And that's a good point as well with like animations and adaptive design, thinking of performance as well. I can think of off the top of my head.
Yeah, that's another area where most users, a well-designed animation or something like that, a screen capture video, something like that can be really instructive and helpful. But consider someone that can't see it or somebody that may be distracted by that animation. Again, having it be adaptable, providing transcripts and good text descriptions in addition to that animation or video content just allows the user to consume that in the way that's going to be best for them.
Fair. They have the choice. So coming back to more user data and user feedback, what's the best way to gather user data and feedback? Would anecdotal data be best? If possible, it would also be good to show any WebAIM data.
Yeah, so collecting user data is something that we do a lot at WebAIM, and a lot of that is born out of our own interest and maybe demand in the field of accessibility. And we sometimes find ourselves saying things like, "Oh, screen reader users prefer this," or users with low vision, they do this on the web. But we didn't always know. It was kind of anecdotal based on our own experience and interactions with those with disabilities, but we didn't always know if that was really representative of those populations generally. So we've conducted several surveys of users with disabilities. We've also done some surveys of web accessibility practitioners, those that are implementing accessibility, just to get a good sense of what they're doing, what their preferences are, what technologies they're using, things like that. The most common or the most popular surveys that we've conducted are of screen reader users. We usually get a couple thousand respondents to that survey. We conduct it every about 18 months to 2 years. We'll be launching our next screen reader user survey here in probably the next month or so. Mm-hmm. And it's just a way for us to get a large number of users of those technologies with and without disabilities, which is always kind of interesting. That way we can compare and highlight any discrepancies between maybe those that are using a screen reader for testing without a disability versus those that are using a screen reader because of a disability. Usually we find there aren't really big differences, but it's kind of curious or interesting for us to highlight those potential differences in responses. But yeah, it just provides us a way to find out what browsers they're using, what screen readers they're using, how they use those screen readers, some of their thoughts about web accessibility generally, and if it's getting better or worse. And we ask a wide variety of questions and fully publish all of our survey results. They're all available at the webaim.org website. You can go to projects at the top and get all of those details from all of the surveys that we conduct. So that's what we do for collecting data. As far as somebody that's building tools or building a website, browsers, things like that. Mm-hmm. How do they get data? How do they get accessibility feedback? And I think the first thing is just to ask, right? Mm-hmm. I think generally users with disabilities are open to provide feedback if you're open about your accessibility needs and where you're at, and just be real transparent. I think with accessibility, your users will tend to be transparent back. And of course, it's important to have mechanisms in there that if there are accessibility issues, that they can be addressed in a reasonable time frame. But I think just that open communication is really helpful. Sometimes we'll work with clients and they say, like, we don't know of anybody with a disability that works here or that could test our stuff. We don't know of any of our customers that have disabilities. And first of all, that's a big red flag.
Yeah.
20% of the population has a disability, right? If you can't identify anybody in your organization or in your customer base that has a disability, that probably is really indicating maybe a culture in your organization that is not very inclusive. and that you probably have accessibility issues, and those with disabilities are using somebody else's product, right? Somebody else's
Mhm.
website or browser or whatever it might be. So it's always a bit of a red flag. And I think building that accessibility and building a bit of community around that accessibility of platforms and products and services can really help provide an audience there that can provide feedback for accessibility and provide some of that data that can be really helpful, specifically to what it is that somebody might be building.
Fair. And it's interesting you bring up a sense of transparency and community because these are actually very important in the blockchain space.
Mm-hmm.
So it meshes really well, and that's why we're trying to encourage everyone in the space to really like hone in on that and just like get that feedback and get the process going now. It's all this tech is very early stage, so we have to we address it now. We'll be much better off than 10 years from now when it may be too late.
Yeah. Another interesting challenge in that space might be the anonymity in
Yeah,
those types of environments, and how users with disabilities can approach that, and that privacy and sensitivity to just even to the fact that a user may have a disability is something to be considerate of, and you can't really detect if somebody's using a screen reader or has a disability. So in order to collect that data, you would need them to disclose that. And that can, there's some sensitivity around that type of thing, and especially in association with blockchain and some of those types of things. So there's maybe an interesting question there for this space that they'll need to navigate a little bit.
for sure. And appreciate you asking that. That's going to be definitely part of a larger conversation and things to consider. Because, like you said, some people are comfortable sharing certain information, but certainly not everyone. So it'll certainly be interesting.
Yeah.
Um, so I want to move on to now more talking about browser accessibility. So what's important to keep in mind in terms of accessibility for the browser itself? In Web3, there's this new emerging idea of Web3 browsers, which are designed to help facilitate interactions with Web3 applications and protocols. And they have native support by like having, for example, built-in wallet. And they actually, a lot of their biggest features are that they provide means to block third-party tracking and help increase user privacy. So what are some important considerations for these types of browsers to keep in mind?
Yeah. It's interesting because there's a lot there. I think when it comes to the browser, the kind of user interface, user agent type of accessibility, because it needs to support accessibility itself of the platform itself, keyboard accessibility within menus and the interactions. It also needs to interact properly with assistive technologies like screen readers. And there's an awful lot that goes into that. It really is fairly technical and something that needs to be built in. And most of the major standard web browsers have over time gotten pretty good at that.
Mm,
There certainly are some bugs and issues and things that we're still working on, but they've really refined and built those accessibility platforms and APIs into the browsers themselves to then support that accessibility for the user and the user using it, various assistive technologies. And so, there's others have kind of laid the framework for that. They've gone through that hard work of building and speccing out those accessibility APIs and things like that. So it's important that these new Web3 browsers integrate that, that they're really considering accessibility and hopefully early, right? These things are hard to build into platforms after the fact, right? But if they're integrated early, that accessibility is going to be a lot easier. So I think that's a couple things, right? Just probably using standard APIs, not trying to entirely, rebuild things the wheel from scratch, right? Because there are good APIs and structures out there to provide that accessibility that can be emulated without any I think, really need compromise to the foundational aspects of those Web3 browsers themselves when it comes to privacy and so forth. So yeah, those are a few things I think to keep in mind, and like maybe related to the previous question, just getting user feedback and building some community around that. So there are mechanisms that if there are accessibility issues that are identified, that they can be addressed in a timely manner.
For sure. Some kind of preliminary, we were looking at it, exploring it a bit deeper. So browser development by itself is also really difficult. So
Yes.
I'm going to exercise a little bit of kindness there, but absolutely in the sense that we need to address like this now and talk about how there's definitely room for improvement. So far, to our knowledge, we're aware of an individual who leverages a screen reader that was able to use some of these browsers pending some minor workarounds. But in the category for captioning, users that require captioning and users that require more measures for motor accessibility, such as customizable UI, a little bit dictation as well. There were some strong complaints in some forums. To some of these teams' credit, they are addressing accessibility issues, but there's like this open acknowledgement that there's plenty of room for improvement again, and as well, they may have encountered some issue relating to the privacy and security with the example of captioning. There was a mentioning of that. But back to your point, there should be some work done there to make sure it's there. But if there's pending issues with the security aspects, that should still address it.
Yeah. There really are three things that all need to align for that accessibility to work well. One is the user agent itself, the browser, really needs to support that accessibility. Then there's the user side, right? They need to come to the table with some knowledge of how to utilize that accessibility. They need to come with technologies that support it. Come with a screen reader technology that's going to support standard accessibility APIs. And then the third one is the content, the authoring side of that, that also needs to integrate that accessibility in order for that content to be accessible. If the browser does its work and the user comes with a modern screen reader that can utilize that, but they go to some application or content that hasn't addressed accessibility at all, then we have a failure there. So getting all three of those together is really important. But the browser, it does play a pretty critical component in that, because it really is that intermediary between the user and that content itself.
To get to the second part of that question, can we talk about some differences to keep in mind between the existing browsers in terms of like designing accessible websites and Web3 decentralized apps and the Web2, as we say, regular applications?
Yeah, anymore, while there are some differences, it's nothing compared to what it was, 10 years ago, even 5 years ago. That browser support used to be just a real struggle. That was a real challenge from that author side, right? That you could build this web application or web content and integrate standard accessibility techniques, and it might work fine in one browser and wouldn't work in another browser. And if that's the browser your users use, then they're connecting their screen reader, and who gets the blame? Not the browser. You do as the author. And because that browser is that intermediary between the content and the user experience, that's where a lot of that accessibility tends to break and fall apart. Fortunately, a lot of work has gone into standardizing those accessibility APIs and how they're presented to assistive technologies and the way that users interact with those. And so that issue of kind of browser support and browser compatibility and consistency is much less of an issue these days. And for the most part, for most content, if you test it in one browser, you can be reasonably assured it's going to work the same in all of the other major browsers. And it's taken us a long time to get there, though, and a lot of work in speccing out how that content is to be supported, how those accessibility APIs align with assistive technologies. If you have a real example of this is with ARIA, Accessible Rich Internet
Mm.
Applications. It's a specification for defining accessibility in HTML content to support screen reader accessibility in ways that HTML does not currently support. So it's kind of a bridge or an extension to HTML to support better accessibility. When we first started integrating ARIA, it was browser support for it was all over the place. And, you could write that code and it would work one way in one browser and a different way in a different browser. And that was really frustrating. But a lot of work has gone into this, especially at the browser developer side. They've worked together to harmonize those things and to define specifications that define how those things are supposed to work. HTML5, same thing. Really trying to standardize and better define for the browsers how they should respond and work with certain code structures and functionality. And so I think it really is much less of an issue. We still need to consider that, especially for cutting edge, innovative types of things, newer code and things like that, where the browser support may vary a little bit. But for most content authors, those are just building content and building basic functionality, really is much, much less of an issue. And so I don't know if I have like any specific recommendations on that other than to consider that question. And if there are, and do some testing, right? Do testing across those browsers, do testing across various assistive technologies as well. And our surveys can give feedback, data about the technologies that are being used by users. Make sure that you're testing those. One caution I might suggest, though, is that a lot of the development tends to happen and testing tends to happen on the Mac platform, right?
Yes.
I see a lot of Macs, and we go out and do trainings, and a lot of those developers we're training are using Macs. And while the Mac and Safari and VoiceOver, the built-in screen reader for Apple products, has really good accessibility, it's not as commonly used by those with disabilities. And so that's a caution I think that kind of applies generally. Just make sure you're considering what your users are actually using and not just having tunnel vision into the platform that you are using, that you're building, that you're developing on, because it very often, especially in the case of Apple, can be quite different from what your actual users with disabilities are using. So, and branching outside of that, and just doing some cross-browser, cross-assistive technology testing is important, but more so, especially with those kind of newer types of things where that support and compatibility might be in question.
For sure, especially if you're capable of enhancing security and enhancing privacy for users, everyone should be able to benefit from that.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's kind of an area, I'm not sure where the Web3 browsers are at, but that's, those are areas that the Web2 browsers have really explored and are, they're not perfect by any means. But I think there's a good model there for that accessibility support that can be emulated and replicated as we're branching out into these new areas.
Sometimes taking a step back before going too forward is a good idea for most teams.
Yep. But most of that just comes to awareness too, right? Just caring about Absolutely. This, just knowing that it's an issue and being aware of it and ensuring that it's being prioritized is that's sometimes the biggest battle. The technical stuff will work itself out once you have that commitment and leadership to ensure that accessibility is happening.
It kind of goes through like all stages of the team as well. It's not like some people think it's just on the developers, but it's on kind of everybody's role to check these things, all the way from product management.
Yeah, we spend a lot of time in our consulting and work with our clients in doing just that. We call it shifting left, right? Having that accessibility, be considered early in requirements and early design and things like that. Then accessibility, it's going to be part of that entire design and development process. But yeah, sometimes it's just development, or worse, it's even a QA process, right? And accessibility becomes entirely a bug fixing exercise. And almost always when it's a bug fixing exercise, primarily or entirely, you're never going to run out of bugs. They're going to continue to be introduced just as quickly as they can be fixed. And so yeah, that shifting left is is really powerful aspect of web accessibility generally, but definitely when we're talking about this whole new kind of area of
Mhm.
of exploration and content and functionality and privacy and security and transactions. It's really exciting. I think the potential for those with disabilities, but we just have to make sure accessibility is forefront in that entire thing.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right, because the pace of innovation in this space is quite fast. I'm an engineer myself, so it goes very fast. It's sometimes hard for people who are full stack in the space to keep up. So taking that time now to really reevaluate before hitting like pedal to the metal.
Mm. Yeah, great.
So let's see. So we covered most of it. I guess maybe just some. Do you have any closing points?
And maybe just kind of reiterate that I just think the potential in this space and the impact it can have on end users, especially to have independence and all of those things. I've heard it said that the web is the great equalizer for people with disabilities. I think that's a real powerful thing that allows those with disabilities to do things independently on their own time using the technologies that they need and the privacy and security that they desire and all of those things. And this really does have the potential to add to that, right? To really be an
Mhm.
equalizer for those with disabilities if it's really considered and they're not left trying to catch up. There's always going to be this gap, I think, between innovation and accessibility. As much as we can do to shorten that gap, that timeline between when we're building things and when accessibility occurs, is really impactful, especially in these areas, as you said, that are moving so quickly. They're innovating so quickly. Really important that gap is not getting wider, but it's getting shorter over time. And that's gonna be impactful. It's gonna be real impactful for those with disabilities. So it's exciting to me.
So I want to thank you so much, Jared, for your experience and insights. It was a privilege having you here with us. I do also want to say a small thank you to Dr. Roland for her work with WebAIM and also putting us in touch. And then also thank you to the Ethereum Foundation for sponsoring the series and caring about accessibility initiatives.
Okay, very good. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.